I'm sure that most of you have read that arresting little story from the pen of Washington Irving entitled Rip Van Winkle. The one thing that we usually remember about the story is that Rip Van Winkle slept 20 years. But that is another point in that little story that is almost always completely overlooked. It was a sign in the end from which Rip went up in the mountain for his long sleep. When Rip Van Winkle went up in the mountain, the sign had a picture of King George III of England. When he came down 20 years later, the sign had a picture of George Washington, the first president of the United States. And Rip Van Winkle looked up at the picture of George Washington, but in looking at the picture, he was amazed. He was completely lost. He knew not who he was. And this reveals to us that the most striking thing about the story of Rip Van Winkle is not merely that Rip slept 20 years, but that he slept through a revolution. While he was peacefully snoring up in the mountain, a revolution was taking place that at points would change the course of history. And Rip knew nothing about it. He was asleep. Yes, he slept through a revolution.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to worship. It's good to have all of you here. It's good to be at the church. And welcome to all of you who are watching online today. By the way, it's good to be. It was good to be gone. It's also good to be back. And by the way, did any of you, were you all here last week for the sermon? Grace Braun, one of our parishioners, is going to go to seminary, and she was here preaching. If you did not hear the sermon, I encourage you to go online and listen to it on YouTube. It's really very well done. So Grace, if you're watching, thanks so much. It was nice to get the break. I did it while I was away. I did a little scuba diving, and I did a little pheasant hunting, and I did a little bit of reading. I read and still am reading a book by N.T. Wright. It's about hope. It's called Surprised by Hope, and I have to tell you, the book is so powerful that as I was reading through it, I had kind of a basic idea of what I was going to do with my sermon series for this year. Well, a lot of that got changed, and so you can see the graphic behind me here. The sermon series for the entire year is going to be based on the theme of focusing on Jesus. And not just, I want you to get familiar with the core stories, and for some of you to get familiar again, but not just that. More importantly, I want you to dive into the impossible nature of who Jesus is and what Jesus does to and for our world, and how that applies to our everyday life. Okay? So focus on Jesus, and the clip I just showed you is from the last Sunday of March in 1968, and of course that was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. who was preaching. As fate would have it, that would be his last Sunday sermon that he would ever preach, because just a few short days after that, April 4th, King was cut down by a sniper's bullet. And so the lesson that he was preaching on, actually two snippets from the end of the book of Revelations, is, first of all, it says, "The former things are passing away, and behold, I make all things new." Right? It's talking about the impossible nature of what happens in the Christian faith. That this isn't just a changed world, it's a new world. And for King, that was certainly the case in his day and time, for sure. And there were lots of people who were asleep in all of this. Nearly everyone was. And it had been going on for a long time, long before King came onto the scene. In fact, until 1947, everyone was asleep. 46, 47, somewhere in there, just after World War II, and it really hit when Jackie Robinson hit the major leagues. And then people started to see it, and people started to hear it, and one thing rolled into another thing, into another thing. But this has been going on for 350 years. First with slavery, and then after slavery, Jim Crow, the Klan, and really an entire nation that turned a blind eye. 350 years. So no wonder everyone was asleep. No wonder no one could see what was coming down the pike. And furthermore, it looked impossible. I mean, if the abolitionist movement couldn't change things, if a civil war with hundreds of thousands of lives lost couldn't change things, if a constitutional amendment couldn't change things, then what could? But of course, that's kind of our God's MO. He starts with impossible things, and he makes them possible. He is the presider over the end of the world as we know it. And he is the architect of making all things new. And what's more is this is not a spiritual making all things new. It happens in this world, in this time. It happens as we live our lives, not as the world as it should be, but the world as it is. A world of hatred, a world of violence, a world that would take one group of people and make them lords over another people so that those people had nothing except slavery. And then they became nothing after the slavery was gone. This is a God who makes all things new. Now, there's a lot more to say about that, but for right now, let's just stop and let's sing. So, Rip Van Winkle, just one other quick thing about that. We're all asleep until at the end of World War II, and then comes Jackie Robinson. And one by one, slowly, we begin to wake up from that slumber to see that a new world is upon us. And it's still happening today. Still, people are asleep. I mention that because of the lesson that Kay just read. Thank you, Kay, by the way. Because that's what's happening in this lesson as well. There's God is the leader of a revolution. He brings about revolutionary things, and he does so as people are asleep, as people are slumbering through the revolution. So this revolution that Kay read about starts during the time of King Herod. Luke makes a point to mention that Herod is king of Judea at that time. We all know about Herod the Great, right? He's a nasty guy. You know the Bible story, another Bible story. He's driven by such galloping paranoia that he has no problem whatsoever and to murder 2-year-old children in the hopes that he can also, while he's murdering these children, kill a baby king, Jesus. But it doesn't stop there. He also murders 3 of his own sons and 1 of his 10 wives. And he does this because he sees them as a threat. And then his last order before he passes away himself, round up important people in Judea, get them all together in one place, and kill them, because I want people to mourn when I die. Some guy, huh? And God's revolution begins there. There's more. God's been silent for a long time. Just like God was silent through slavery and Jim Crow law. God had been silent for a period of 400 years. There was no prophet that was raised up at that time. There was no leader to lead God's people in the ways of righteousness. There were no miracles. There were no signs. There were no wonders. Just silence. And into that, God comes. He comes to a man by the name of Zechariah. Zechariah is a priest. He's one of 12,000 priests. So he's kind of a face in the crowd. And what's more is that Zechariah is leading worship that day. But with 12,000 priests, not everybody can do that. And so they draw lots to see who's going to be the worship leader that day. Zechariah's name popped up. So it's completely random. And while everyone else, all the other priests and all the other people are outside the temple praying, Zechariah is inside the temple lifting those prayers up to God. He's by himself. Right? There's more. Facing the crowd, right? Ordinary guy. He's an old man. His wife is barren. They've never been able to have children. God comes there. He sends his messenger. And when he does send his messenger, an angel by the name of Gabriel, and this messenger tells Zechariah that you are not only going to have a child, but that child is going to be the beginning of my revolution, Zechariah doesn't believe it. He says, how can this be? And then he lists off all the ways that it's impossible. But that's kind of God's MO, isn't it? He finds impossible circumstances and makes them possible. By the way, that kind of sounds like another story we know from the Bible, right? Anybody recognize those features? The story of Abraham and Sarah, right? 2 old people. She can't have children. Messengers come sort of at random, and they put out a spread for these messengers, and the messengers say you're going to have a child, and Sarah thinks that this is so funny that she laughs out loud. Old woman, 89 years old, going to have a child? I don't think so. It's impossible. Impossible things. And yet, there is God in the middle of impossibility. And he takes this impossible situation, and for Sarah and Abraham, here comes one child, Isaac. And then eventually another, and another, and another, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, until there is a family so large that if Abraham were to look up into the night sky and see the stars and try to count them, he couldn't count them all. And that's the size of his family. God creates out of that kind of impossibility. And here we are again, the very first chapter of the book of Luke. really the opening salvo of our focus on Jesus. And it's Zechariah and it's Elizabeth, and they're old. He's a face in the crowd. She can't have children. And Zechariah doesn't believe. He sort of laughs like Sarah laughs. And God says, I don't think it's funny. You know, impossible things happening. Being barren, who cares? God can work through that. Being old, you'll just have to work through your aches and pains and your arthritis because you're having a child. Disbelief, that's nothing for God. That's nothing, because he takes that and he turns it to his advantage to begin the story of another man who comes in and does impossible things. I mean, think about it, folks. I'm going to just tip my hand here a little bit. How impossible is resurrection from the dead? Talk to a doctor. Doc, you're here. Not possible, right? God makes those things possible. In trial and trouble, when it looks like nothing can work, God makes those things possible. And by the way, resurrection, it's not a spiritual resurrection, it's a physical resurrection. It happens here, it happens now, in this world as it is, not as it should be, but as it is with all the sin, trial, suffering, sickness, and death. There it is. Let's stop for a minute. So I recently, as a matter of fact, just this last week, had a conversation with a young woman. And she was telling me about her faith journey. She grew up in a religious home, went to church every Sunday. Her parents, grandparents, ardent believers. And she grew up the same way until she got to middle school, when her cousin, who was 17 years old, died completely unexpectedly, out of the clear blue. And of course, this rocked her to the core. And in the midst of all of that, God was silent. He wasn't saying a thing. Now, other people were speaking for God. They would say to her, you know, God only takes the best. Oh my, we have to have a talk about theology sometime. That's horrid theology. And of course, what did it do to her? But it further entrenched her in the belief, in the conviction that this could not possibly be a good God. I mention this to you because I know that each of you have been through, in your own way, an experience where God has been silent. And maybe it's been something like that. Or maybe it's something else. Maybe it's a relationship that's on the rocks. Maybe it's a sickness. Maybe it's trouble. Maybe it's mental health issues. Maybe it's an addiction. And you're trying to find your way through. And you find that God is silent. And that silence lasts so long, that's sort of like Rip Van Winkle. You climb the mountain and take a nap because nothing's going to change. My friends, I am here to tell you that this is a God of impossible things. He is the one who presides over the end of the world as we know it. He is the architect of all things new. And that's not someplace in the by and by. It's not spiritual. It's here and it's now. In your life, as it is, not as it should be, but as it is right now, with everything out of joint. God is a revolutionary, and He is changing your world. Believe it, know it, and step forward in the promise of that hope that He comes to you where you are. I mean, think about it. I'm going to tip my hand again. We didn't go to God. God came to us in Jesus, in a baby born in a manger, not up in heaven someplace, not in some distant arena far away, but becomes a flesh and blood human child. Impossible, right? But that's our God. He comes to us in impossible things, and He makes all things new. Amen.